So let's start with our first panelist, Ms. Roshni Patel.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about a Buddhist phenomenology of the pain and seeing suffering. And just to go over a quick outline, I'm going to start my presentation by talking about an affect that is coined as samvega in Sanskrit or in Pali. And then I'll say a little bit about what suffering is, and my goal is to give an existential account of suffering as it's conceived in Buddhism. I'm going to talk about samvega then as second-order suffering, borrowing a term from Maria Lugones, and then finally I'll conclude with the benefits of this account. So to start by defining samvega, I'm going to present an image. This is an image from the Buddha's life story, and I'm going to tell it very, very briefly. So the Buddha was very sheltered throughout most of his childhood. So when he was Prince Gautama, he didn't see suffering for a very long time. His father went through great lengths to make this the case. But one day in his adolescence, he went on a chariot ride, and deities from another realm manifested in the form of what we call the divine messengers. So in the foreground, we see the messenger of death, as well as the messenger of sickness. In the background, we see the messenger of old age. And then finally, we see the fourth messenger, who's a renunciant. The important part of this part of his story for us is that he experienced this incredible shock upon witnessing suffering in this way. Because he didn't previously know about suffering, this was a very existential moment for him, where he felt compelled to do something, he felt like he was learning something. This sort of was world-shattering for him in a number of ways. And it's also thought to be a significant catalyst in his story for what then ended up being his embarking on the Buddhist path. I have a morphology here from the Sanskrit, but I don't really have time to get into it. But what I want to present as a tentative translation of a definition is that samvega is something like a compulsion to move or act. It's a state of agitation that is stirred by emotional grief or fear. And these are definitions that I borrowed from scholars, and I use the formatting to sort of highlight some common themes. In the bold, we see that samvega has this sort of violent quality to it. It's driven by fear. There's a sense of urgency, and it's framed as a perturbation. In the italics, we see sort of more positive connotations that are associated with samvega. Samvega is this state of curiosity, of asking questions. There's an incredible awe and wonder about the human condition that's involved in it. It's also considered to be a healthy type of disenchantment and a positive perturbation because it will catalyze something meaningful thereafter. And then finally, in the caps, I have sort of notes about the fact that samvega leads to a transformation. For Buddhists, what's valuable about this is that it's going to propel kind of a spiritual path or spiritual progression, but we might understand it also as a moral transformation too. In this paper, one of the things that I want to highlight is that samvega is a shock upon seeing another suffering that is very particular. You're seeing a particular other in a particular moment, dealing with a particular type of suffering. You're also recognizing a condition as suffering. So in just a moment, I'll talk a little bit about how suffering isn't evidently so. There are all kinds of states of suffering and conditions of suffering that don't necessarily appear as such. But the Buddha was actually recognizing what he saw as suffering in that moment, and that's really integral to what the experience of samvega is. And importantly, samvega doesn't really provide any sort of access to the feels-like quality of another person's suffering. There isn't any sort of identification with the other person. There isn't any sort of subjective kind of access to the first person's stream through samvega. It is an experience that is incredibly painful. It is not gentle or tender. It's a type of learning that actually is going to be transformative, that's going to create upheavals, that's going to be disruptive. But this is in part because samvega is revealing. And what I want to say is that it reveals the severity of suffering in the human condition. And so even though it is an experience that is quite particular, it actually is an experience that reveals something that is universal in the human condition, which I want to call finitude. And it helps us sort of understand suffering in a framework that provides some comprehensibility. So now let me say a little bit about what suffering is in the Buddhist sort of schema. Again, I have the morphology, but I don't really have time to dig into that. But what I do want to point out is that suffering is a translation that is incredibly imperfect and imprecise. And I want us to note that suffering is not necessarily only phenomenal or felt or experiential. It can exist as a condition or as sort of an existential state that doesn't register on the phenomenal level, in fact. And so it's not only a sensation. What I want to argue is that we can think about suffering, or we can think about dukkha rather, as a pervasive or an enduring condition of vulnerability that's inherent to finitude. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about thinking about dukkha in terms of finitude is that this account actually deviates a little bit from the standard Buddhist account. Usually in Buddhology, we very quickly move to thinking about suffering in terms of its etiology, because in the second noble truth, suffering is linked to craving, aversion, and ignorance. But that sort of shifts the account to one that's heavily psychologistic rather than existential, rather than kind of thinking about our constitution and how that leads to dukkha. The other benefit in thinking about dukkha existentially is that it provides a nice link through the Four Noble Truths, in fact. If dukkha is the problem and the liberation is actually going to involve something like compassion and other regarding affects, then we need to have an account of suffering that also sort of focuses on what relation is doing in suffering as well. And finitude sort of helps us get to that. So I'm going to read just a little bit from my chapter for a moment, and then I'll move on. Finitude is generally conceptualized as a matter of having limits and taking particular form. One important insight coming out of Buddhist teachings is that these limits do not have the same quality of boundaries or borders. While we cannot be limitless to the point of being absolute, the limits that give us form or constitute thresholds are dynamic. They shift in place over time and are porous in nature. This exacerbates our precarity. Where our limits lie and how they work are yet another matter of unsteadiness that demands far too much of us in the way of adjustment, letting go, and embracing newness. However, this dynamism to our limits also enhances our capacities for relation with those things beyond our limits. Indeed, the openness in our constitution serves as a fruitful basis of care. So I'm going to talk a little bit about suffering through a schematism that is offered in Buddhist thought, but sort of shift it to a more kind of existential account in terms of limits. So suffering is generally thought to take three different forms. There's intrinsic suffering, suffering from impermanence, and then finally suffering from conditions. And you can see my excellent PowerPoint skills in these little diagrams here. Intrinsic suffering is suffering that actually registers on the phenomenal level. So this is probably what most of us think about actually when we're thinking about suffering. So this is suffering that is felt as painful or unpleasant. But it's not only embodied suffering. It can be something like sickness, aging, or death, but it also could be cognitive or affective in nature. The reason that intrinsic suffering is linked to finitude is because it is part of being a sensate finite form. The second type of suffering is suffering from impermanence. And we might think about this as suffering in terms of loss as well. But I also want to kind of recognize that what's going on with impermanence is that our limits are shifting in place. They're shifting in nature as well, kind of constantly. So that's represented by these overlapping triangles with that sort of red-orange rectangle down there. These overlapping rectangles that are shifting in place. And it's guided by a mistaken belief in stability, and for which we have actually inherent instability. One of the things that is often invoked when we're talking about suffering from impermanence, however, is that this type of suffering is the product of attachment. And I think this metaphor is a little bit misleading because attachment sort of implies a kind of external appendage, like a hat that you can easily take on or off. And I think it's important to actually think about suffering from impermanence with relation to things that are more intimately incorporated into our Constitution. So these little shapes right here kind of figure as things that adhere to different parts of us. So say if I lose a job, it's not just going to be kind of losing the job, and that's an easy thing to sort of remove from my being. It's actually going to be the case that losing the job is going to affect my material security, it's going to affect my sense of time, it's going to affect my values, my anticipations of the future, my goals. It's going to affect a number of different things, and each one of those parts that kind of gets severed is going to produce its own wound. And then finally, there's suffering from conditions. And this is probably the most complicated form of suffering, but it basically hinges on the idea that our Constitution is formed over time, and it's formed in the nature of dispositions and proclivities and habits that get relatively settled, but that also have to shift in relation to different environments. So there's sort of this conflict between something that is fairly cemented and having to move through various environments that are incredibly dynamic and that sort of infiltrate our Constitution over and over again in ways that we welcome and in ways that we also do not welcome as much. So let me return to the concept of samvega now as second order suffering. This is a term that I'm sort of borrowing from Maria Lugones and her account of second order anger. When she talks about anger, the object of anger in second order anger is the unintelligibility of her first order anger. So she's talking about this in a feminist context wherein she is angry about something and people cannot understand why she's angry, in fact. The links that I see between these two affects is that there is kind of a doubling that's involved in both of them. For Lugones, second order anger is anger because of anger, in fact. And in samvega, there is pain upon seeing suffering in somebody else. Another link that I see is kind of epistemic in nature. The object of anger in second order anger is the unintelligibility of the first order anger. And the object in samvega is the incomprehensibility of somebody else's suffering, right? That's part of why it's a shock, because one simply doesn't understand that. One hasn't incorporated it into their understanding of humans as such, or perhaps even as of a particular human. There's also an urgency. Lugones characterizes second order anger as having an urgency that wishes into being an extremely delicate possibility. And similarly with samvega, there's an urgency to act or move that is driven by both fear and knowledge. Lugones calls second order anger a state of transformation. She calls it a metamorphosis at another point in the same article. And samvega is very much an emotion that compels. Also, these are emotions that are not necessarily transparent to other people apart from the subject who's experiencing it. So second order anger appears irrational because someone is trying to communicate something that doesn't quite make sense in the world of official reality. And similarly, samvega is irrational relative to ignorant views that cloak suffering for most of us. So part of what's involved actually in seeing suffering as suffering is sort of a hermeneutic that's informed in a way that perhaps is different from our conventional manners of navigating our lives. Lugones calls second order anger cognitively rich, and samvega is similarly a form of learning. I can slow down a little bit. I sort of was rushing. Not really, though, actually. So why is this helpful? I'm thinking about this in relation to a few different subfields. In the ethics of care, I think samvega kind of helps us navigate the relationship between the particular and universal, which is sort of this snare that continually becomes a problem, I think, within that field. In Buddhist ethics, There is also a way that compassion becomes more fitting as a response when we recognize suffering as like a dealing with finitude, I suppose. And we think about suffering as a matter of enclosure and exposure, or finitude with relation. And then in the philosophy of emotion, there's an interesting sort of relation between affective agitation and sort of the epistemic element of incomprehensibility that I also think is really, really interesting. So lastly, I just want to thank everybody for being here, for listening, for the conversations we've been having, for your presentations, and also the organizers for putting this all together. Thank you so much.